All right, hey everybody. So this is a short video tutorial on some basic Linux items and obtaining our Git repo with a little bit of additional Git instruction added, and also a quick introduction to the code that is in the repo with a focus on the simple UDP program. Okay, so you should be looking at my desktop now, and you're looking at a VM, and I am about to create the do a git clone of this CPSC 8510 repo. So let me actually switch real quick to Buffet and okay, so we've looked at this in the past. This is a repo sort of front end that the School of Computing staff did some time back. It is available to students, staff, faculty, so you can create your own repo and or database. When I log in, these are all the different repos that I have. One's for our class, so I have staff one, which basically is the one I would use, and then I transfer what I want to release to the class by copying it into the right directory in the student repo. So we're interested in cloning the student repo. So we click on it, and so from here, notice that there's actually two URLs. The one that you may not actually see this URL, but you should see this URL. So when I created the repo, I clicked the button that said, I want this to be made available to anybody. So the restriction is they, as of last semester, I think, they put Buffet, this server, behind Clemson firewall. So you have to be VPN'd or on campus to be able to access the repo. So I'm going to copy that link and then go back to the VM. So what is going on? I don't like this window. So I just got rid of that window because it didn't have a bar on the top that I could use to move it. All right, so I'm going to specify term. It should start a terminal, and there we go. Okay, so I'm going to place the repo directory that is a collection of all prior repos used before. So I've already created the CPSC 8510 staff repo. I'll do a git clone of the student repo. Actually, I'll do this. Okay, and now because I did a clone using that anonymous link, that means that I can't, from this repo location here that I've just downloaded, I cannot do updates. On another machine, I actually have done clone using the my private URL, which is restricted to administrators, and that gives me write access to the contents. So in other words, you should not be able to do a git push on changes made to the class repo. You could try it and tell me if it works, because I would like to know. All right. Now we'll step into student repo. What this is. Okay, and we've seen, I've been through this in class before. The bin directory contains some helpful script files, and my suggestion to you was to create a bin subdirectory from your home directory. So when I say home directory, you do a CD with no parameters. Normally CD is change directory to some new directory you want to get to. You do a CD with no parameters, it immediately takes you to your home directory. Okay. If you're, next time you're on a department Linux machine, you may want to do do an ls to see what's in /home. And on this VM, not all that much. So basically any account that I've created should be listed. On the Linux machines, the configuration is much more complicated, and so you'll see a whole bunch of other stuff. Okay. Back to repo. Actually, let me give another Linux basic tip here. So when you're trying to bounce between different directories, it could take a lot of typing. And there's ways around reducing the amount of typing. So first, bash sort of by default. So again, right now we're entering characters into a program called bash. So bash is a shell. It's one of many different types of shells that are basically come with any Unix system. By default, bash is sort of the standard shell for Linux systems these days. If you do a PS, which is basically a list of processes, you'll see that we're running bash. Okay, and so one thing that bash does for us is it will, if you type, for example, the first couple of characters of a directory you're trying to CD into, try hitting the tab key, and bash is going to try to fill in or guess the next part of what the target actually is. If it's clear to bash, if it could figure out completely, after the first couple of characters, it'll immediately show you the directory, and you can just hit enter. So at this point, because there's multiple directories that begin with CPSC, it's stopped. So now we have to give it another help. We'll say 8, and it says, okay, there's 2 choices now. Or actually, there's 4 choices. So we'll say 8.1, and now there's 2 choices, student or staff, and we're in students. Current working directory shows the full directory, and the next way to minimize the amount of typing to get to places, especially locations in the file directory structure that you go to often, such as the repo on your VM, I would create an alias, which makes things, that's the easiest way to get to a particular directory with minimal typing. So what is an alias? If we do a man alias, okay, so there's no man page for it. We do a man of bash, and then search for alias. Okay, help that much. Okay, so here we go. So bash aliases, the internal list of aliases as maintained by the alias built-in. Okay, so in bash, there are a number of commands that you can obviously execute. So from bash, we could do the command cd, okay? And we can find out where the cd program is located, but with a which. So which cd, that didn't help very much. Okay, we can also do something called locate cd, which basically is going to give us way too much information. So that's basically finding all files that have the 2 characters cd in it. Or apropos cd, and okay, so we were talking about ways to avoid typing when you're using cd to get to places, and the bash comes in to help in a couple of different ways. One way is with this something called an alias. All right, so let's clear the screen. Clear. And now let's try and do a man of alias. Okay, so no man there's no manual page for alias. And that's true of, let's see, ls, there is a man page. For cd, there is not a man page. For an application that we know that we've added to our system, like iPerf, there is a man page. So a couple of items here. From bash, we can actually run programs that come from a number of different sources. And we actually get to my website and point out a couple Linux documentation PDFs that you might find helpful. So www.review/. Courses 851 and our schedule. All right. So just FYI, this list of videos will grow. So there's an additional video that I'll be adding shortly that talks about transport protocols. Okay, up at the top here of our web page, before we get into the each day of the week, are a bunch of pointers, and one of which is Linux information. So this is the top level page for a whole bunch of stuff that I put together related to Unix. Most of it is Linux, I guess. So way back when, I think I mentioned GNU. And when you have time, you should take a look at the page pointed to by that link there. It gives you a good background on what GNU is all about. And GNU was actually an operating system, and sort of under the umbrella of GNU, all the tools that are now we're familiar with in the world of Unix, many of them come from GNU. So it's a open source brand, I guess. And what's interesting is the discussion on this link by this fellow, Richard Stallman, who back in the 80s basically developed GNU. And it's interesting the way he puts this. So he's saying that many of its users of Linux are not aware that it's basically GNU. So I guess the key point here is what makes Linux Linux, okay, versus something else. And the answer is it's the kernel. So Linux today consists of the Linux kernel, and then for the most part, all the GNU software. And there's obviously exceptions to that, but that's basically the case. Other operating systems similar to Linux, so like FreeBSD has its ancestry from the 70s and 80s when BSD Unix was developed. So FreeBSD uses the BSD kernel, not Linux. And for the most part, all GNU stuff on top. And again, there's exceptions, but so that should give you some insight into what exactly Linux means. Okay, so at the bottom of this, so these are links with basic information about GNU pieces or components. So Linux documentation project, this is meant to be the Linux community's online documentation. And for the most part, it's very helpful. A lot of the material that I point to on this page comes from that website. Let's see. Bash Guide for Beginners is very, very useful to get an overview, actually to get lots of details of Bash. I don't know if it's the best single document that is the most helpful. So I'm actually looking for something in particular. So this is the GNU page for Bash. Okay, so maybe this is what I was looking at. Next command org. Okay, so this might be the best starting point if you are a novice in Linux. You know, it gives you the basics, learning the shell, writing shell scripts, and they refer to this book, which I believe is an online book. It's available for free. Okay. And I'll actually put a link directly to this book. And maybe what I'll do is stick to using this book in the future when I talk about Bash and point things out. Okay, so I'm heading someplace by going through this. There's something a couple pages away that I wanted us to see. So have patience here. Okay, so basically saying, why do you need to learn the details of a command line? And that this is one perspective, but the bottom line is, if the more that you are familiar with Linux, the better off you're going to be in terms of being able to find a job. So in other words, most development, and especially development platforms, are most likely Linux. Linux is pretty much always in a back end these days. So in a data office or website and web apps, it's all Linux-based stuff in the back end. And so there's Linux and Bash, and then there's the web components associated with that, which is a whole nother class, right? And because there's a ton of frameworks out there that operate at the back end or operate out at the client browser end that really require a huge learning curve for any of them. And so one person told me the best advice is, the more frameworks that you can claim to be an expert with, and have that on your resume, the better off you're going to be. But if you don't understand something, the basics, the foundations of a Linux system and some of the details of Bash, then it'll be difficult to go much further in to the degree that really is required out in industry. So that's the answer to why bother. Working with commands. Okay, so here we find some example commands: type, which, help, and man. Man we know about. Help is similar to man, but it's for something called a built-in, shell built-in. I'll explain that in a second. Which is used to locate a command. Type is to display information about a command. And the thing I wanted to get to here is commands can be one of four types. A program, like our example would be like iper, something that we've actually installed, or it could be something that we build, like the simple UDP program. A command built into the shell itself. So bash has a number of commands within it called built-ins. CD is an example. Alias is another example. That's why we don't see man pages for CD or alias. The shell can also run a shell function, and shell functions can exist in a file, so that we would normally call that a script. So basically, bash is parsing that file, and the syntax is bash. So we really could enter each line of the script by hand directly into bash. But using a file is more along the lines of what we're used to, right? Where if we're developing a program or a script in this case, we put it into a file. All right, then the last thing that could run is something called an alias. So commands that we define ourselves. And so 2 minutes ago, I mentioned 4 commands. Type was one of them. Type is, well, which is one of them. So if we do a which of CD, can't find it. If we do a which of alias, can't find it. The reason is because it's a shell built in. So there's not an executable anywhere called alias. It's a function that's within the bash program. The command type is super useful because it tells you what type of program the command is. So type iper, so that's basically telling us it's a program that's been installed. Let's see, the Linux or the Unix find command, which is actually super useful. So the general syntax is find starting point, and then any number of classifiers. So we're basically telling find what we're interested in. So I'll say star.c, any C file, and then for that, for every one of those files found, this last component is what we want done with it. And so we just want to list them. Okay, and these are C files. Find is a program which is super powerful, and it could take a week of study to master it, but we will learn the basic use scenarios for find because it is really helpful. If we type find, okay, find is hashed. So that means that it's a Unix program. So it comes with the operating system. And a witch should be able to find it as well. Okay, so we know man will provide documentation for programs. For programs that are installed, like iPerf, right? We had to issue a sudo apt install iPerf. The installation, it's up to the developer, but the norm would be an open source tool that is meant to be shared and used by anyone on a Linux system. You typically would add your own man pages to the package that that apt would install. So that's why we have man iperf. If you're on a system and you type man iperf and it comes up back with nothing, then that means you probably don't have iperf installed. You can also determine iperf is if it's installed or not by which. And let's see. All right, then we also learned that help is effectively the man for built-ins. And I'm hoping to find a list of built-in functions here. Oh, that's not it. Oh, there we go. Okay, so issuing help with no parameters is going to give you a help, basically an info page. So we can grep that to normally everyone greps, or sorry, pipes that output to a pager, like more, where more is a program that basically gets input from standard in and only shows a screen full at a time, right? That's called a pager. Another pager, which I like much better than more, is less. Less is newer than more. And if you're gonna learn either a pager, there's other choices actually, but less is probably the best one to use. It looks very similar, but it's actually more like VI, okay? So like you could do backspace, you could do searches. And it's just a little bit more versatile. Okay, so this is showing us all the built-ins of Bash. And so in some of the scripts that we look at, you'll see some of these that have been used. We've already used some of these. So for example, you see logout, you see pwd, you see kill, right? Those are things that we've talked about. And now we're in a bit more detailed discussion of Linux, and those are examples of built-ins. All right, so we want help alias. Okay, so alias -p name value. Okay. define or display aliases. So that's what the alias built-in does. It allows you to define or display an alias. Usually when I create an alias, I place it in ls space dash a lt. You'll get the hidden files, which means the files that are dot something. And one of those is dot bash rc, which is a script that runs every time you start a bash shell. And this looks a bit different from probably what you see, because I've taken the standard bash rc and modified it. We'll talk about history in a second. But let me get to alias. So I have defined alias, and the alias name is gojit small s, and there's another one big S. So this would be for this, to get me to a particular student repo, and this gets me to a particular staff repo. And so prior to making, so last time I used this VM actually was, I was teaching CPSC 3600. So I'm going to change this to 8510 students, 8510 staff. So the syntax for an alias, there's no room for error here, so be really careful. It's the name of the alias equals single quote, and make sure you have the end quote, and then the command. Okay, if you modify .bash rc, you need to start a new shell to pick it up. So if we do alias, in the help it said, if you run alias, it will list all of your aliases. Okay, so that's all of my aliases. All of those come from my .bash rc, and we'll test gojit s, and it put us in CPSC 850 students. Okay, so alias is, I think, the easiest way to navigate your file system, especially for locations where you go to a lot. I won't say any more about shell scripts aside from, you may want to run this bash tutorial because you will learn something about bash. So I had a student in, I think it was 624.0 that did this for a homework assignment. And it'll take you about 2 minutes to get through this, but you'll learn. All right. We're going into the code directory in MATLAB. I'll actually have a short video that I'll prepare that talks about MATLAB and uses what's here. Python. So for those that are interested, I'll place in this subdirectory, interesting Python programs. So right now there's two, Sysmon and UDP Echo 2. So Sysmon is effectively a Python version of the bash script system monitor that we've mentioned before. And system monitor, which is located in bin, its job is to show us the periodically the rate at which data is being sent or received over a interface. And so you enter system monitor with no parameters, gives you help, and it also lists the interface names. So I will run system monitor. First parameter is just a tag, an ID. Second parameter is going to be the interface and EMP0S3. Let's see. Yeah, it's S3 is the main interface. System monitor sys EMP0S3. And then interval, we'll say every second. Iterations 0 for run forever. Output mode, I'll just say 1 because we just want it to go to standard out. Enter my password. Oops. And we see periodically the information that we would expect. And we went through the output of this before the middle, so the 1.00, 1.19, 1.32, those are meant to give us a estimate of the load on the CPU, right? We get that. cat/proc/load average. Okay, and so the first 3 fields are the average number of processes waiting, that are ready to run, waiting to run. And the first field is measured over 60 seconds, the second measured over 5 minutes, and the third over the last 15 minutes. All right. So in the code directory, let me very quickly show you. This was the code that was given to you, right? So whenever you get new code, just by habit, you should do a make clean and a make all. Okay, and I have an alias in .bashrc lse, which basically does an ls of all executables. So it shows me the executables. I also have an alias lsd, which is going to show me all the directories to see what lse looks like, alias lse. And so in my .bash rc, you would find exactly this. So I'm using the find command to show me the executables in the current directory. So 3 executables are created. The getaddrinfo was meant to help digest the information in Donahue chapters 3 primarily, that talk about the correct way to deal with internet addresses. And so if we look at that source code, so this is a single program, getaddrinfo. And when we run it, we give it two parameters, a name, which could be a domain name or a name in dotted decimal, and then a service or a port number. So the reason why they call it a service rather than a port number, the system is able to translate well-known port numbers into their commonly understood applications. So for example, HTTP translates to port number 80. All right, and so actually I wanted to point out a couple of items here. Okay, so all this program is going to do is it's going to take the address that was passed in along with the port, and it's going to show all valid IPv4 and IPv6 addresses that that name, assuming it's a domain name, has registered. Okay, so this is effectively interacting with DNS, the domain name system. And the code appears complex, but it's not. And again, I urge you to read the Donahue text to really understand this. There is a struct that this program has created, adder criteria, it's declared right there. So it's type adder info, and that struct has fields that allow us to enter in the basically parameters that when we actually issue the interact with DNS, we're going to provide some hints as to what kind of addresses to return. Okay, and so AF underscore unspecified, basically that's saying we're interested in both V4 and V6. Okay, if we only wanted V4, we would say AF underscore INET. If we only wanted V6, we would say AF underscore INET 6. And then if we're interested in, typically these aren't all that important. So in other words, if these were sock datagram or IP proto underscore UDP, we would get the same information back. Okay, so we have a struct that we're going to use, which will be a list of adder infos. So adder info is the generic address structure. So here we actually invoke the socket library called getaddrinfo, which in turn invokes the local resolver, which is the DNS client, and it does what it needs to do to learn and get the IP addresses with the based on the address string and based on the additional hints that we give us. or that we give that call. In return, when it returns, adder list is filled in. As true of virtually all Unix system calls, a return of -1 implies an error. Otherwise, typically greater or equal to 0 is usually success. Normally when I check for errors, I would say if it equals -1. Okay, and here we're going to walk through the adder list. So the adder list is, let's see. Okay, so it's basically a linked list. And each element is going to, the address is going to be held in this field of the struct. We're calling this helper routine print socket address, saying print this address to standard out. And when we're done, we are to issue a free address info on adder list. So in other words, get adder info allocates memory on our behalf and gives us the pointer with the addresses filled in. So it's our job to free that memory. Okay, and that's how I'll end this video, which was sort of covered a couple of different things. You know, gave you some basic Linux information, and sort of oriented you with our Git repo. There'll be additional videos that will cover this code in detail. And that's it for now.